Kia ora. Hello. We are back looking at the crisis of the late Middle Ages. I was hoping to get this series complete in the next couple of weeks, but there are a few topics that we need to cover off to do that. This week, we are discussing the role of the Black Death, also known as the Great Mortality. If you're a long-time subscriber, you may know that the Black Death is one of the original series that we released doing an in-depth analysis on the latest theories on the cause, spread, and finally, the economic impact the plague had on medieval society. If you've not watched that series, I have included a playlist here and down below. Now, you may be asking yourself, hey, Andrew, why don't I just watch those videos and skip this one? Fair question. You could, but I do have my history blazer on and I'm sitting in the history chair, so we might as well keep on going. In this video, I'll be discussing the plague and how it factors in as part of the crisis of the Middle Ages and how to start to tie some of those threads together. I'm Andrew, and this is Popula Urbanum, a show where we discuss reenactment and the medieval middle class. To give a brief rundown on the plague, in October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived in Sicily. These ships spread the plague on the island. In January 1348, the plague arrived in Genoa and Venice, and then Pisa. The plague, which was spread by human traffic, travelled northward past the Alps into France, and most likely into the Champagne trade fairs, and then via other trade routes. This first plague lasted until 1353, to be followed up by a second wave in 1360 to 63, then a third in 1374, followed up again in 1382, 1400, 1438 to 39, 53 to 57, and then so on every 15 years or so. The first wave had the highest death toll, with estimates ranging from 45% all the way up to 65% of Europe's population dying of the plague. This level of mortality had long-lasting impacts on medieval Europe's economy, society, and beliefs. First, let's have a brief look at the economic impacts first. The plague had massive consequences to the economy of Europe. As I have discussed in our previous videos on the collapse of feudalism and elsewhere, wealth was locked in the hands of the elites. The plague was the catalyst in which the wealth was spread back into the rest of medieval society and the economy. In the aftermath of the plague, the richest 10% of the population lost their grip on between 15 to 20% of overall wealth. The impact of the plagues was long-lasting. The elites were not able to regain this level of control on overall wealth before the second half of the 17th century. But how did the plague release this much wealth? The first and most immediate way was in the form of inherited wealth, and also in the abandoned properties. Inherited wealth was often spent, while people took possession of abandoned properties and started their own businesses. The second way was in the form of wages. For the rural landholders, the labour shortages were dire. They could no longer keep workers tied to their traditional bonded roles. With such a labour shortage, workers started to demand increased payments for their labour, else they move on to an employer who would pay more for their services. Additionally, we see women engaging in more paid labour. Though usually at half the rate of men, this too brings more wealth into the rural households. Initially, while the rural landlords tried to keep workers in their place at the same wages and conditions, ultimately attempts failed and rural workers overall gained better wages and a lessening of their feudal obligations. The same too can be said of the urban centres. The labour shortages and loss of supply impacted the incomes of the traditional urban elites. The value of wage labour increased and many more people were able to enter into business. Post-Black Death, many new ways of handling business emerged. Successful traders became more agile in the markets and took on more and varied risks, building extensive networks and maintained a firm hand on their overheads to build extensive trade empires. The reduction in population had an added effect in driving down costs of items, and the cost of produce lessened. Although during the initial stages of the plague, the cost of many things rose steeply due either to demand or supply. Post-Black Death, however, even though there were fewer people to work the land and demand was down, the markets balanced, meaning that the cost of food became more affordable. This had a lasting effect on people's lives. These increased wages and lower living costs meant people such as the peasants were able to purchase or lease land, which they were able to then use to create value for themselves. The most enterprising were able to become large farm holders themselves, which eroded the power of the feudal elites. This too was true for the urban counterparts. Many now had greater capacity to set up their own businesses and enter into masterhood. Those canny enough in the ways of trade surpassed the traditional patrician elites in wealth, such as my personal favourite historical figure, Francisco de Tini. The causes the plague had on religion, however, was not as positive as the impacts on the economy. High mortality rates within the church caused the number of clergy to decline, which was then struggling to meet the religious needs of the population. The layperson turned to the church for salvation. However, the reduced numbers could not meet their needs. Those that survived the plague fled, refusing to perform last rites. This was a terrifying prospect to the medieval person, and one of the most important rituals in the Catholic Church, Last Communion, since this put a person's soul at risk, wasn't performed. So, with a dwindling clergy and priests refusing to perform their duties, people were being buried without mass. This forced bishops and later the Pope to declare that anyone could say last rites to ensure a soul enter into heaven. Again, this eroded the authority of the church. Adding to this, the quality of priests within the church was on the decline. Younger and more experienced priests and monks were ordained to fill the ranks. This impacted the quality of discipline, services, and knowledge within the church. The priesthood, which had already been criticized for greed prior to the Black Death, soon sought to line their pockets even more. Experienced priests and bishops sought high wages for services and performed mass in private chapels for extra pay, and started to place a greater importance on indulgences. As the church was unable to perform their role in meeting either the temporal or spiritual needs of the laity, people began to turn away from the church. They tried to find their own ways in practicing spirituality and practiced the roles that the church traditionally performed, such as charity themselves. The number of lay hospices and charities increased post-Black Death as more people turned away from the church to provide these services, as they no longer thought the church capable to do so. It can also be said the worldview of the medieval person changed, now becoming more pessimistic with the world around them in response to the great trauma of the plague. They saw that the plague was punishment from God and a sign of the end times, one which did not come. Instead, they looked to the world around them and saw sin in all its forms, and perhaps this was the cause of their misery. Once the medieval person would look to the church to shepherd them through this tragedy and offer them comfort. Yet this was a church that had failed them and had fallen to greed and lust. So again, we need to look to this and wonder, how was this a crisis? Well, obviously, the death of millions and the spread of a disease that still haunts the world today. That's quite a crisis. But how does this fit in with the crisis of the late Middle Ages? Well, that's another question altogether. The Black Death was another tipping point for a society already under tension, already suffering wars and famine, poverty and massive inequality, and a rebellion here and there. The arrival of the Black Death threw medieval Europe into chaos. While people were able to capitalize off this chaos, it did not happen happily, and the transference was not easy. The changes to the economy and improvements to wages were not handed over. Much of this came from political agitation. And as I've discussed in our video on the rebellions and causes of the rebellions, many of these were very complex. It is very true that many agitations were an attempt to get better pay and representation for workers. But this was not only because of the Black Death. If anything, the Black Death was the final straw for people who had been suffering under inflation and in stagnating wages and wars for centuries. Much like during the Great Famine, the propertied elites did not respond to the workers in a coherent fashion to address their concerns during this time of great social upheaval. Instead, they chose to protect their own needs. This fueled a struggle between the worker and the propertied elites, which would last for centuries. So too did the transference of property to the rural worker damage the traditional role of feudal lords and contribute to the collapse of the feudal system, which caused more social upheaval. Finally, with the erosion of the trust of the church and the priesthood, this led many people to consider the teachings of so-called rogue priests such as John Ball, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and finally Martin Luther. All who challenged the way the church conducted itself temporally and spiritually, where once the church would have been able to rally both the aristocracy and the peasantry against such unorthodox thinkers. We also have to point blame at the Western Schism as well for its role in the rising distrust of the church, but we're going to have to do a separate video for its part in the crisis of the late Middle Ages. Of course, I've not even begun to list the upheavals that the Black Death caused in Europe, how it impacted trade, education, fashion, art, or even the rise of the medieval middle class. But as I say, this is the topic for another video. Oh, I didn't see you there. That must mean you must have enjoyed the video. So, why don't you like, comment, and subscribe? And remember, stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.